The Godfather is one of the most celebrated films ever made. Don Corleone, sitting behind his desk, dispensing justice, refusing the drug trade, kissing his grandchildren in a tomato garden, building something that looked almost noble from the right angle. Hollywood gave organized crime a face that audiences could respect, even admire. But the men that story was actually built on were nothing like that portrait. Carlo Gambino ordered a boss gunned down in a barber chair to take a family. Vito Genovese aligned himself with Mussolini and had an anti-fascist publisher killed in Manhattan as a favor. Vincent Gigante walked the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe for 30 years pretending to be insane. Paul Castellano was shot 6 times on a midtown sidewalk during Christmas shopping season. Salvatore Rina dissolved a 13-year-old boy in a barrel of acid. Today, we are covering what The Godfather does not show you about the real mafia bosses. What you are about to hear is worse than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Section 1. The composite, the myth, and the men Don Corleone was built from. In November of 1969, a novel hit American bookstores that would change the way the country thought about organized crime forever. The book was called The Godfather. The author was a 49-year-old writer named Mario Puzo, who had never been a member of the Mafia, had no real personal contact with any of the 5 families of New York, and had built almost the entire story out of newspaper clippings and his own imagination. The book sold 9 million copies in its first 2 years. 3 years later, in March of 1972, Francis Ford Coppola released the film adaptation. The face on screen was Marlon Brando. The character was Don Vito Corleone. The image of the Mafia in the American mind was set, and it has never really come unset since. What audiences walked out of theaters believing they had seen was a portrait of organized crime as a kind of shadow aristocracy, a family business with a code, a boss who refused the drug trade because it was beneath him, who kissed his grandchildren in a tomato garden, who dispensed favors at his daughter's wedding, who lived by a sense of personal honor that the legitimate world had lost. The Don in the film was a man audiences could respect, even admire. The performance was extraordinary, the writing was sharp, and the cinematography turned mid-century New York into something that felt almost mythic. The character was not based on a real person. Don Vito Corleone was a composite, assembled by Puzo out of pieces of at least 5 different real mafia figures, with the inconvenient parts of each one filed off and discarded. Puzo himself acknowledged in later interviews that the character had been built from the lives of bosses he had read about in news reporting and crime histories. The result was a man who never existed and could not have existed, because the qualities that made him admirable on screen were drawn from one boss, while the qualities that made him powerful were drawn from another. The first piece of the composite came from Frank Costello. Costello gave Don Vito his manner, his political reach, and most famously, his voice. Marlon Brando watched footage of Costello's appearance at the Godfather Senate hearings in 1951 and built the raspy, careful delivery of his performance directly from what he saw. Costello was the man who had bought judges in New York for 2 decades through his connections at Tammany Hall. The man who had placed roughly 25,000 slot machines across the city by 1934. The man whose nickname inside the organization was the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The film took his calm and his political instinct. It left out the slot machine empire, the bribery network that ran from his living room into the courthouses of Manhattan, and the fact that one of his own associates would put a bullet through the side of his head in May of 1957. The second piece came from Carlo Gambino. Gambino gave the character his low-key personal style and his family structure. The frail-looking grandfatherly figure who avoided publicity. The boss who lived in a modest row house and was remembered for offering FBI agents coffee and dessert before going with them to be booked. Gambino served only 22 months in prison across a criminal career that lasted more than 50 years. He died of a heart attack in his Long Island summer home in October of 1976 while watching a Yankees game on 10:30 television. The film borrowed his discipline. It left out the fact that he had ordered Albert Anastasia to be gunned down in a barber chair to take over the family in 1957. The third piece came from Joe Profaci. Profaci ran a legitimate olive oil import business in Brooklyn that earned him the nickname the Olive Oil King. And his cover gave Puzo the famous detail of the Corleone family operating an olive oil company called Genco Pura. The film took the cover business. It left out the fact that Profaci was so disliked by his own men that as soon as he died of cancer in 1962, the family was renamed for his successor to erase his memory. The fourth piece came from Joe Bonanno. Bonanno was Sicilian-born, came to the United States in 1924 by stowing away on a Cuban fishing boat bound for Tampa, Florida, and became a boss of one of the 5 families at the age of 26. The film took his old-world Sicilian dignity. It left out the 1963 plot in which Bonanno tried to assassinate 4 other commission bosses, including Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, in a single coordinated move to seize the entire organization for himself. The fifth piece, oddly enough, was the surname, Vito Genovese. Puzo borrowed the first name and a touch of the surname feel because it sounded right. He did not borrow Genovese's biography, and there was a reason for that. Genovese was the figure on the list whose actual life was the hardest to romanticize. The composite worked as fiction because Puzo selected the pieces that fit together into a coherent man. The real bosses did not fit together. They feuded with each other, ordered each other killed, betrayed each other for territory, and most of them died either in federal prison or with their faces against the pavement of a New York street. The Don Corleone audiences fell in love with was a man who never existed. The men he was built from existed in court files, FBI surveillance recordings, sentencing orders, and the eventual testimony of informants who broke a code that the films had treated as sacred. The fictional Don Corleone was a composite of 5 men, each contributing a single quality the films could afford to keep on screen. The next case is the boss who came closest to actually living that life. The man who died free in his own home, and whose home the FBI had spent years trying to bug for nothing more than the words frog legs. Section 2. The boy from Passo di Regano, the man who died in front of a Yankees game. On August 24, 1902, in the Passo di Regano neighborhood on the outskirts of Palermo, Sicily, a boy was born into a family that already belonged to the local mafia. His parents named him Carlo Gambino. The Gambinos had been part of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra for generations, and the boy grew up in a world where the rules of that organization were as familiar to him as the streets of his own town. By the age of 19, he had already been formally inducted into the Sicilian Mafia, allegedly serving as a teenage hitman before he ever set foot on American soil. The exact details of those early years remain uncertain in the public record, with some accounts coming from later FBI summaries rather than contemporaneous documentation. In 1921, at the age of 19, he stowed away on a ship and entered the United States illegally. He settled in Brooklyn with cousins who were already connected to the Prohibition-era boss Salvatore D'Aquila. The boy who would eventually become the most powerful organized crime figure in American history arrived in the country as an undocumented immigrant with a mafia pedigree that almost no American gangster of his generation could match. What separated Gambino from nearly every other figure in this story was a single fact. Across a criminal career that lasted more than 50 years, he served only 22 months in prison. The conviction came in 1937 for tax evasion related to operating a 1-million-gallon distillery in Philadelphia, and he served his time at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. After he walked out of Lewisburg in 1939, he was never incarcerated again. Not for one day, not for one night. The federal government, the FBI, the New York State Police, and the United States Department of Justice spent the next 37 years trying to put him back in a cell. None of them succeeded. The reason was discipline. Gambino spoke softly. He dressed plainly. He lived in a modest row house in Brooklyn, far from the kind of mansion other bosses preferred. When FBI agents arrived at his home with warrants, he reportedly offered them coffee and dessert before leaving with them for booking. The frail-looking grandfather with the prominent nose and the friendly grin was a careful construction. Anyone who looked at him for the first time tended to assume he was the last person in the room who could possibly be running anything. He had married his first cousin, Catherine Castellano, in 1926. They had 3 sons named Thomas, Joseph, and Carlo, and a daughter named Phyllis. Catherine was also the sister of Paul Castellano, a future boss who Gambino would eventually choose as his successor. The bloodlines ran in every direction. When Tommy Lucchese took over what would become the Lucchese family, Gambino arranged for his son Thomas to marry Lucchese's daughter, locking the 2 families together permanently. Within Gambino's organization, the family business was, in the most literal possible sense, a family business. His path to the top of the New York organization ran through one of the most famous ambushes in mob history. In October of 1957, Gambino was the underboss of the family, then run by Albert Anastasia, the figure known inside the organization as the Lord High Executioner. Anastasia had become unstable, paranoid, and increasingly violent. Vito Genovese, the boss of the family that would eventually carry his name, wanted Anastasia removed. Genovese approached Gambino with a deal: help arrange the hit, and the family would belong to Gambino afterward. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia was sitting in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel on West 56th Street in Manhattan when several gunmen entered and ended his life. By the end of the day, Carlo Gambino had taken control. The family that had been called the Mangano family, then the Anastasia family, was renamed for him. It still carries his name today. What he built over the next 19 years has no real parallel in American organized crime history. The Gambino family expanded into John F. Kennedy International Airport, where it took working control of the unions that managed every load of cargo coming through. It moved deeper into construction, garment manufacturing, garbage collection, and the waterfronts of New York and New Jersey. Federal estimates placed the family's annual revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Gambino instituted a policy across his organization that became known as Deal and Die. Any soldier or associate caught dealing narcotics was to be eliminated. He understood that long federal sentences for drug offenses turned soldiers into informants, and the rule was meant to be absolute, even though it was not always followed by the men beneath him. The FBI placed his Brooklyn home under continuous surveillance. They tapped his phones. They installed listening devices at meetings he was known to attend. After 2 years of intensive bugging, the only words they had captured Gambino speaking at one high-level meeting with other top Mafia figures were the words, "frog legs." He had grown up under Sicilian Mafia discipline and understood with absolute clarity that the most dangerous thing a boss could ever do was speak openly. In 1969, the federal government finally indicted him for masterminding an East Coast hijacking ring. Legal proceedings dragged on for years. His wife, Catherine, died in 1971. His own health began to fail. When prosecutors discovered that he had never become a United States citizen, that he had been smuggled into the country in 1921, deportation proceedings were opened against him. His doctors testified repeatedly that his heart was too weak for the journey to Italy. The case was delayed, then delayed again, amid persistent rumors that the family had paid 2 United States senators to slow the process. The deportation never happened. In October of 1976, Gambino was at his summer home in Massapequa on Long Island, watching a Yankees game on television. He had a heart attack. He was 74 years old. He died there, in his own house, never having spent a single night behind bars since 1939. Before he passed, he had named Paul Castellano as his successor. The transition was confirmed at a meeting on November 24th with the family's underboss, Aniello Della Croce, present. The handover was meant to keep the peace inside the organization. It did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carlo Gambino died, free, in front of a Yankees game, with the FBI still listening to bugs that had recorded almost nothing. The next case is the man whose voice Marlon Brando studied to build The Godfather. The boss who placed 25,000 slot machines across New York and was shot in his own apartment lobby in May of 1957. Section 3. The Calabrian boy who became the Prime Minister of the underworld. On January 26, 1891, in a small village called Loropoli, on a mountain in Calabria, Italy, a boy was born to a family that owned almost nothing. His name was Francesco Castiglia. His father ran a small Italian grocery in East Harlem after emigrating to the United States, and at the age of 4, Francesco crossed the Atlantic with his mother and his older brother Edward to join him. The Castiglia family settled in East Harlem in 1895, in the kind of crowded immigrant Manhattan that produced almost every major figure in this story. Most of the boys who grew up on those blocks ended up working legitimate jobs that paid almost nothing. Francesco chose a different path before he was old enough to understand what the choice meant. By the time he was 13 years old, his older brother had already introduced him to local street gangsters, and Francesco had begun running with the 5 Points gang in Lower Manhattan. He committed petty crimes through his teenage years, was jailed for assault, robbery, and weapons possession at least 4 times between 1908 and 1918, and built a reputation as a young man who was useful in a fight. He met Charles Luciano during this period through the Morello family, an early Italian gang that was the predecessor of what became the Genovese crime family. The friendship between the two men would shape American organized crime for the next 4 decades. In 1918, at the age of 27, he made 2 decisions that defined the rest of his life. He married a Jewish woman named Loretta Geigerman, almost unheard of for an Italian gangster of that era, and he stopped carrying a gun. After his last weapons conviction, he had decided that brains were a more effective tool than firearms. He kept that promise for the rest of his life. The other decision was a name change. The young Italian gangster reinvented himself as Frank Costello, an Irish-sounding surname he picked up partly from his work with Irish bootlegging crews, and partly because Luciano later said it did not hurt to have an Italian boss with a name like Costello when the organization moved deeper into New York politics. What turned Costello from a small-time street figure into one of the most powerful men in the country was prohibition. The 18th Amendment took effect on January 17, 1920, and the entire alcohol industry of the United States moved underground overnight. Costello partnered with Luciano, with Meyer Lansky, with Bugsy Siegel, and with a network of Irish bootleggers, including Bill Dwyer and Oni Madden. Together, they built one of the largest rum-running operations on the East Coast. Estimates from the period place the combined annual profits of the Costello, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel group at around $4 million by the late 1920s, which was an enormous sum for the era. Costello himself was indicted with Dwyer in 1926 on federal bootlegging charges. The case ended in a deadlocked jury, and the charges against him were eventually dropped. The mentor who reshaped Costello's understanding of how power actually worked was Arnold Rothstein, the Manhattan gambler who had famously fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein taught Costello how to dress, how to speak in rooms full of politicians, and how to think about crime as a business that ran on relationships rather than violence. After Rothstein was killed in November of 1928 in a dispute over a poker game, Costello inherited his connections inside Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that effectively ran New York City. The inheritance was the foundation of everything Costello built next. Through the 1930s, Costello moved into the rackets that would make him one of the wealthiest men in organized crime. He controlled bookmaking and slot machines for the family that Luciano had reorganized after the Castellammarese War. By the mid-1930s, Costello had placed roughly 25,000 slot machines across New York City in bars, restaurants, candy stores, drug stores, gas stations, and bus stops. In 1934, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia confiscated thousands of those machines, loaded them onto a barge, and dumped them into the Worth River in a famous public stunt. Costello responded by accepting an offer from Louisiana Governor Huey Long to install slot machines across Louisiana for 10% of the revenue. The Louisiana operation was run by Costello's associate, Phil Castell, and ran for decades. What separated Costello from every other boss of his era was political reach. Through Tammany Hall and his personal relationships with Democratic Party power brokers in New York, Costello had a working network inside the courthouses, police departments, and legislative offices of the city. There is a widely repeated claim from the period that no judge reached the bench in New York during the 1930s and 1940s without Costello's approval. The exact accuracy of that claim is impossible to verify in the public record. But federal investigators, congressional witnesses, and journalists writing during the period all agreed that his political influence was unlike anything any other mafia figure in American history had ever achieved. Inside the organization, the nickname stuck: Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. When Luciano was convicted in 1936 on compulsory prostitution charges and sentenced to 30 to 50 years, Costello became one of the most senior figures running the family in his absence. When Vito Genovese fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid a murder indictment, Costello rose further. By the early 1940s, he was the acting boss of what was then called the Luciano family, and he was running it more profitably and with less violence than almost any other organization in the country. The moment that revealed how the public saw him came in March of 1951. A Senate Special Committee, chaired by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, was investigating organized crime in interstate commerce, and Costello was called to testify in front of national television cameras in New York. He agreed to appear on the condition that his face not be broadcast. The committee complied, but the cameras stayed fixed on his hands. For hours, Americans watched his fingers fidget, twist, and clench as he gave evasive answers about his net worth and his business associates. The footage was so striking that Marlon Brando watched it 20 years later when preparing to play Don Corleone, and built the slow, careful, raspy delivery of the character directly from what he saw. Costello eventually walked out of the hearing on the second day, claiming a sore throat. He was later convicted of contempt of the Senate and sentenced to 18 months in prison. What ended Costello's reign was not the law. It was a younger mafia figure named Vincent Gigante. On the night of May 2, 1957, Gigante walked into the lobby of 115 Central Park West, where Costello lived, and fired a single shot at his head from close range. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp and lodged behind his ear. He survived. The wound healed quickly. His position inside the organization did not. Costello stepped down as boss shortly afterward and handed control to Vito Genovese, the man who had ordered the hit. He retired to his Waldorf Astoria penthouse, took up gardening, and began entering his roses in local horticulture shows. He died of a heart attack on February 18, 1973, at the age of 82. Frank Costello survived a bullet to the head and retired to grow roses, while old associates still came to ask his advice. The next case is the man who ordered that bullet fired, the boss whose actual life is the part of the story Hollywood has never been willing to put on screen. Section 4. The boss the films will not tell the truth about. On November 21, 1897, in a small village called Resigliano in the comune of Tufino in the province of Naples, a boy was born to a poor Italian family. His name was Vito Genovese. His parents named him after a relative, and the name would eventually become attached to one of the most powerful organized crime families in American history. He completed school only through what would be the American equivalent of the 5th grade. In 1913, when he was 15 years old, his family emigrated to the United States and settled in the Little Italy neighborhood near Mulberry Street in Manhattan. By the age of 19, he had his first conviction, a 1-year sentence for illegal gun possession, and he had become close friends with another young aspiring criminal named Charles Luciano. The friendship between Genovese and Luciano was the engine that drove much of what happened next in New York organized crime. Both men went to work for Giuseppe Masseria, the Prohibition-era boss known as Joe the Boss, who ran what was then the largest Italian gang in the city. Genovese became one of Masseria's most trusted enforcers and hitmen. In February of 1930, Masseria allegedly tapped Genovese to murder Bronx Mafia chief Tommy Reyna with a shotgun, suspecting that Reyna was conspiring with Masseria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano. The Castellamarese War followed, and Genovese was one of the 4 men present at Joe Masseria's table at the Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on April 15, 1931, when Masseria was gunned down in a coordinated hit ordered by Luciano. 5 months later, Maranzano himself was eliminated in his Park Avenue office in another hit Luciano arranged. Vito Genovese helped engineer both murders. He was 33 years old. When Luciano reorganized New York organized crime into the 5 families and created the Commission, Genovese was named his underboss. The position made him the second most powerful man in the family. He held it for less than 5 years. In 1934, an associate named Ferdinand Boccia was murdered in a dispute over a stolen card game pot worth about $60,000, and Genovese was widely understood to have ordered the hit. Witnesses to the case would eventually disappear or refuse to testify, but the New York District Attorney's Office began building a murder indictment against him. In 1937, before the indictment could be brought to a head, Genovese fled to Italy. He took an enormous amount of cash with him, reportedly enough to live in luxury indefinitely. He settled in Naples and quickly inserted himself into the local power structure. Italy at that time was ruled by Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime, and Genovese, despite running an organization based on the survival of immigrant Italians in the United States, openly aligned himself with Mussolini. He befriended Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, and reportedly supplied him with cocaine. According to FBI records and later Italian investigations, Genovese gave the order in January of 1943 for the murder of Carlo Tresca, an Italian-American newspaper publisher in New York who had spent his life writing against fascism. The hit was carried out in front of Tresca's newspaper office in Manhattan as a favor from Genovese to Mussolini. Tresca was 63 years old. When the United States Army arrived in Italy after the Allied invasion of 1943, Genovese pivoted again. He offered his services to American military authorities as an interpreter and an intermediary with the local Italian population. He used the position to run black market operations on a massive scale, selling stolen American military supplies for enormous profit. He was eventually arrested by an American military officer named Orange Dickey, who recognized the name from old New York fugitive reports. Dickey had Genovese transported back to the United States to face the 1934 Boccia murder charge. The case collapsed when the key witness against Genovese, a man named Peter Latempa, died in a Brooklyn jail cell on January 15, 1945, after being given what was officially recorded as a dose of medication for his ulcers. The medication was later determined to have contained enough poison to kill 8 horses. The murder charge was dropped. Genovese walked free. The 7 years between his return to the United States and 1957 were spent rebuilding his position inside the family that Luciano had handed to Costello. Genovese was no longer underboss when he came back, having been demoted in his absence, and he made it clear to anyone who paid attention that he intended to take the family back. He found a willing partner in Carlo Gambino, who had his own reasons to want Albert Anastasia removed. The plan that came together in 1957 was the most ambitious power play in modern American organized crime history. Genovese would have Vincent Gigante shoot Frank Costello, forcing him into retirement. Gambino would have his own gunmen kill Albert Anastasia, who was Costello's main ally. With both men removed, Genovese would take what had been Luciano's family. Gambino would take what had been Anastasia's family, and the two of them would dominate the commission together. It worked. Costello survived the May 2, 1957 attempt, but stepped down. Anastasia died in the barber chair at the Park Sheraton on October 25th. Genovese took over what is still called the Genovese family today, and he immediately did. Something that exposed how badly his judgment had eroded during his years in Italy. He called a national meeting of the entire American Mafia at the upstate New York estate of Pennsylvania boss Joseph Barbara in a small town called Appalachian on November 14, 1957. The purpose was to formalize his new authority and discuss narcotics, gambling in pre-revolutionary Cuba, and the New York garment industry. Roughly 100 mob figures from across the country and Italy traveled to attend. A New York State Police trooper named Edgar Croswell had become suspicious of the volume of food and supplies being delivered to Barbara's estate. Croswell set up surveillance and called in backup. When state police arrived at the property, the mobsters scattered into the woods in their suits and dress shoes. 63 men were apprehended. Photographs of well-dressed gangsters being led out of the woods ran on the front page of nearly every major American newspaper. J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent years insisting publicly that there was no such thing as a national organized crime syndicate, could no longer maintain the position. The Appalachian meeting forced the FBI to create a major organized crime unit and changed federal law enforcement priorities permanently. Less than 2 years later, on April 17, 1959, Genovese was convicted in a federal courtroom in Manhattan on charges of conspiring to violate narcotics laws. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. He attempted to run the Genovese family from his cell through messengers and intermediaries for the next decade. Some longtime organized crime researchers, including former NYPD detective Ralph Salerno, have raised serious questions about whether Genovese was actually involved in narcotics distribution at the level the prosecution claimed, with Salerno arguing that anyone who understood the protocol of how a boss operated would find direct involvement almost unbelievable. Some accounts suggest Genovese was set up by Luciano and Gambino working together to remove him. The full truth has never been settled in the public record. Genovese died of a heart attack in a federal prison medical facility in Springfield, Missouri, on February 14, 1969. He was 71 years old. The family he took by force in 1957 still carries his name. The brutal version of the Mafia he represented, the one with heroin and Mussolini and a poisoned witness in a Brooklyn cell, is the version Hollywood has never been able to put honestly on screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Vito Genovese died in a federal prison medical center on Valentine's Day of 1969, with the family that still carries his name running itself without him. The next case is the man Genovese inherited his most violent reputation from, the boss who ran an organization that may have ended more than 1,000 lives before he ever sat in his own barber chair. Section 5. The Lord High Executioner and the chair he sat in last. On September 26, 1902, in the Calabria region of southern Italy, a boy was born into a large family that had almost nothing. His name at birth was Umberto Anastasio. He was one of 12 children, and his father worked as a railman. The family lived through the kind of poverty that defined much of southern Italy at the turn of the century. In 1919, the year before Prohibition began in the United States, Umberto and 3 of his brothers entered New York City illegally by deserting the merchant ship they had been working on. He was 17 years old. While serving time on death row at Sing Sing State Prison in 1921, he changed his surname from Anastasio to Anastasia, partly to spare his family the public association with a criminal sentence. The change stuck. The man who would be known to history as Albert Anastasia had begun building the persona that would carry him through the next 4 decades. The reason he was on death row in 1921 was a longshoreman named George Torino. Anastasia had been in the United States for less than 2 years when he and Torino got into an argument that ended with Torino dead. Anastasia was tried, convicted of murder, and sentenced to die in the electric chair. He was 19 years old. By a procedural ruling in 1922, he won a retrial. By the time the new trial was scheduled, 4 of the original prosecution witnesses had disappeared. The case was dropped. Anastasia walked out of Sing Sing a free man. What that experience taught him became the foundation of his career. Witnesses could be made to vanish. He was charged with murder again in 1928 in Brooklyn. The witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. He was charged again in 1932. Same outcome. He was charged again in 1933. By the late 1930s, he had become the first man in the documented history of American justice to be charged with 4 separate murders and walk free after each one. He did not stop committing them. The work he became most associated with was an organization the press would eventually call Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate created in the early 1930s after Lucky Luciano had reorganized the 5 families. The original head of Murder Incorporated was a Jewish gangster named Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke. Albert Anastasia was the operating second in command, the figure responsible for actually managing the contracts. The organization was made up of both Italian-American and Jewish-American gangsters, recruited from poor and working-class neighborhoods across Manhattan and Brooklyn. What Murder Incorporated did between roughly 1929 and 1941 has never been fully accounted for in the public record. Conservative figures place the number of contract killings at around 400. Some historians place it as high as 1,000. The exact number cannot be settled because most of the bodies were never identified and most of the cases were never solved. For his role at the operational center of all of it, Anastasia earned 2 nicknames inside the underworld: the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner. The organization came apart in early 1941 when Abe Reles, one of the lead Brownsville hitmen, was arrested and decided to cooperate with Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer rather than face the death penalty himself. Reles had information that could implicate Anastasia directly. Anastasia placed a $100,000 bounty on Reles. On November 12, 1941, Reles was found dead on the roof of an extension below his 6th-floor room at the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, where he was being held under police protection. The official ruling was that he had accidentally died while attempting to climb down using bed sheets. Many investigators believed at the time, and many historians believe today, that he was thrown out the window. The case against Anastasia collapsed. During the Second World War, Anastasia joined the United States Army and used his control of the Brooklyn waterfront to help coordinate naval intelligence operations. For his service, he was awarded United States citizenship in 1943 and was honorably discharged in 1944. The man who had spent 2 decades managing contract killings was now a decorated American veteran. In April of 1951, Vincent Mangano, the boss of the family Anastasia had served as underboss for years, disappeared without a trace. His brother Philip was found dead on a New York area beach. Anastasia was widely understood inside the organization to have been responsible for both deaths. He was called before the commission, refused to accept guilt, and was reluctantly approved as the new boss rather than risk a war. The end came on the morning of October 25, 1957. Anastasia walked into the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan for a routine haircut. His bodyguard had conveniently parked the car in an underground garage and gone for a walk. As the barber placed a hot towel over his face, 2 masked men entered the shop. The men opened fire. Anastasia died in the chair. He was 55 years old. The 4 murder charges he had walked away from finally caught up with him in a chair he could not get out of. Albert Anastasia died in a barber chair on West 56th Street with a hot towel still on his face. The next case is the boss who watched men like Anastasia and Genovese tear each other apart and decided he could outlast all of them. The man who became boss of a New York family at 26 and lived to be 97. Section 6. The Boy from Castellano del Golfo and the Book That Doomed His World. On January 18, 1905, in a small fishing town called Castellano del Golfo on the northwestern coast of Sicily, a boy was born to a family that had been part of the local Mafia for generations. His name was Joseph Bonanno. The town would eventually give its name to the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931. At the age of 3, family emigrated to New York City, lived there for about 10 years, and then moved back to Sicily. He spent his formative teenage years in Sicily under the rise of the fascist regime, and he developed his sense of what the Mafia was supposed to be from inside the actual world that produced it. The fascist crackdown on the Sicilian Mafia under Benito Mussolini's prefect Cesare Mori in the mid-1920s pushed many young Sicilian Mafia figures out of the country. Bonanno was one of them. In 1924, at the age of 19, he stowed away on a Cuban fishing boat bound for Tampa, Florida. He entered the United States illegally and made his way north to Brooklyn, where his uncle, Giovanni Bonventre, was already established in the criminal underworld. Bonanno was drawn into the bootlegging operations of Salvatore Menarzano, who would become his lifelong mentor. Menarzano was the leader of the Castellamarese clan. By 1930, Maranzano was at war with Joe Masseria. The war ran for 14 months. Bonanno fought as a soldier in the Castellano faction. After Masseria was killed at Coney Island in April of 1931, Maranzano declared himself the boss of all bosses. 5 months later, on September 10, 1931, Maranzano was killed at his Park Avenue office on the orders of Lucky Luciano, who had decided that the title of boss of all bosses was a problem rather than a solution. Joseph Bonanno took over what was left of Maranzano's organization. He was 26 years old. He became one of the youngest bosses in the history of the modern American Mafia and held the position for the next 36 years. The Bonanno family built itself on a combination of bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, labor racketeering, and a wide network of legitimate businesses, including a Brooklyn funeral home, a cheese factory in Wisconsin, and a 280-acre dairy farm in upstate New York. He invested in Cuban casinos with Meyer Lansky. What separated Bonanno from his contemporaries was a deep belief in what he called the tradition. He saw the Mafia as a centuries-old Sicilian institution that had been carried across the Atlantic by men of honor. He kept an unusually low profile compared to figures like Anastasia and Genovese, and survived the Appalachian disaster of 1957, along with the federal pressure of the 1950s and 1960s, without serving significant prison time during the years he was an active boss. The mistake that ended his reign was an act of pure ambition. By 1963, Bonanno had decided that the commission was not serving his interests. He developed a plan, working with his ally Joseph Magliocco of the Profaci family, to assassinate 4 other commission bosses in a single coordinated move. The targets were Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo, and Frank DeSimone of Los Angeles. The contracts for the killings of Gambino and Lucchese were given to a Profaci hitman named Joseph Colombo. Colombo calculated that the odds were against Bonanno and Magliocco. Instead of carrying out the murders, he informed the targets directly. The commission moved against the conspirators. Magliocco confessed and was forced to retire. Colombo was rewarded with the family, which from that point on was renamed the Colombo family. Bonanno, refusing to appear before the commission to answer for the plot, fled to Canada and then to Arizona. In October of 1964, he disappeared from a New York street in front of his attorney, telling the public later that he had been kidnapped. Many organized crime researchers, including Jerry Capisi, have argued in published work that the kidnapping was a hoax orchestrated by Bonanno himself to avoid testifying before a federal grand jury. The full truth has never been settled. Bonanno reappeared in 1966. By that point, the Bonanno family had split into 2 warring factions. The conflict became known as the Banana War. It ended with Bonanno's official retirement to Tucson, Arizona in 1968. He spent his retirement collecting Social Security checks, gardening, fending off federal investigators, and writing. The decision that did the most damage came in 1983. Bonanno published an autobiography. The book was called A Man of Honor. In the memoir, Bonanno wrote openly about the structure of the American Mafia, about the commission, about the tradition, and about the relationships between the 5 families. He confirmed in his own voice the existence of the organization that the commission had spent 50 years denying. Federal.
Prosecutors used A Man of Honor as a roadmap. The book became one of the foundational documents that informed the Mafia Commission trial of 1985 and 1986. 8 defendants were convicted in November of 1986. 3 family bosses received 100-year sentences. The commission, as Bonanno had known it, never recovered. Joseph Bonanno died on May 11, 2002, in Tucson of heart failure. He was 97 years old. The man who had walked through the world calling himself a man of honor had spent his retirement watching the organization he built come apart. In part, because of the book he had decided to write. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Joseph Bonanno died in Arizona at 97, having outlived almost every contemporary, and watched the commission he helped build collapse. The next case is the boss who took over the most powerful family in America when Carlo Gambino died in 1976. The man who lived in a Staten Island mansion and was gunned down on a midtown sidewalk during Christmas shopping season. Section 7. The mansion on Todd Hill and the sidewalk on East 46th Street. On June 26, 1915, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn, a boy was born to Sicilian immigrant parents named Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano. His father was a butcher by trade, and he was also an early member of the Mangano crime family, the organization that would eventually become the Gambino family. The boy was given the name Constantino, but he would be known throughout his life as Paul. He left school in the 8th grade to follow his father into the meat-cutting business. In 1934, at the age of 19, he was convicted of robbery in Hartford, Connecticut, and served 3 months in prison. The conviction was the only significant time he would serve until the federal indictments of 1985. After his release, he returned to the meat business, but he never left the world he had been born into. His sister Catherine had married Carlo Gambino in 1932, which made Paul Castellano the brother-in-law of the man who would eventually run the most powerful organized crime family in the country. Through the 1940s and 1950s, Castellano built his reputation inside what was then the Mangano family. He kept a low profile, avoided the kind of street violence that had made figures like Anastasia notorious, and developed a sense for legitimate business that almost no other figure of his generation matched. He invested in meat distribution, in poultry, in trucking, and in construction. By the late 1950s, he was a respected capo. He was at the Appalachian meeting on November 14, 1957, and was among the men apprehended by New York State Police as the gathering broke up. What separated Castellano from the older generation of bosses was a fundamentally different idea of what the Mafia should be. He believed the future of the organization was in white-collar crime rather than the traditional rackets. He pushed the Gambino family deeper into construction bid rigging, into labor union manipulation, into trucking control across the meat industry, into garment industry extortion. He preferred to be known as a businessman who happened to be connected to organized crime. The press eventually gave him a nickname that captured his style: Big Paul. Some accounts also called him the Howard Hughes of the mob. When Carlo Gambino died on October 15, 1976, Castellano was named his successor. The choice was controversial. The traditional rules of succession would have placed underboss Aniello Della Croce, the figure who had run the family's traditional rackets for years, in line for the top position. Gambino chose his own brother-in-law instead. Castellano allowed Della Croce to remain as underboss and continue running the family's traditional crews. The arrangement effectively split the Gambino family into 2 factions. The mansion that defined Castellano's reign was a $3.5 million 17-room residence on Todd Hill on Staten Island, built to resemble the White House. It had a heated swimming pool, a tennis court, and an English butler. Castellano lived there with his wife Nina and conducted most of his mafia business inside its walls. The choice was a serious tactical mistake. In 1983, the FBI obtained a warrant to plant a listening device inside the kitchen of the mansion. The bug ran for several months and produced more than 600 hours of recordings. The conversations captured on those tapes formed the foundation of federal indictments brought against Castellano and the rest of the commission in February of 1985. What made the situation worse was Castellano's relationship with the men who actually carried out the family's traditional work. He was distant. He rarely visited the social clubs where the soldiers spent their time. He had never been a street-level figure himself, and the soldiers who had paid their dues running hijackings and bookmaking operations did not respect him. The crisis that produced his death began with a federal indictment in March of 1985 against several members of John Gotti's crew on heroin trafficking charges. Castellano had inherited Gambino's deal and die policy on narcotics. If Castellano received the FBI tapes through discovery, he would have grounds to order Gotti, his brother Gene, and several others killed. Gotti and his closest allies, including underboss Agnello Della Croce, knew this. Della Croce died of cancer on December 2, 1985. With his protector gone, Gotti had to act before the tapes reached Castellano. He spent the following 2 weeks coordinating a hit with Salvatore Gravano, Frank DeCicco, Angelo Ruggiero, and Joseph Armone. The plan involved 11 men, 4 of them shooters. Castellano was scheduled to attend a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan on the evening of December 16, 1985. At about 5:30 in the evening, with Christmas shoppers crowding the surrounding blocks, Paul Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks. His underboss and driver, Thomas Bellotti, was at the wheel. As both men stepped out of the car, 4 men in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats appeared from different positions on the sidewalk and opened fire. Castellano was hit 6 times. Bellotti was hit 4 times. Both men died at the scene. Gotti and Gravano watched the entire ambush from a parked car across the street and then drove past the scene to confirm both targets were dead. Paul Castellano was 70 years old. He had been the boss of the Gambino family for 9 years. The hit on him was unsanctioned by the commission, a clear violation of the rules Lucky Luciano had laid down in 1931. Paul Castellano died on a Manhattan sidewalk in trenchcoat ambush during Christmas shopping season, an unsanctioned hit that broke the commission's rules. The next case is the man who watched the killing happen from a parked car across the street, the boss who decided that being famous was more useful than being invisible. Section 8. The Dapper Don, the Cameras, and the Underboss who wore a wire. On October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, a boy was born into one of the poorest sections of New York City. His parents had 13 children. The boy was the 5th. The family had no steady income, since the father drifted through unpredictable work as a day laborer. The family moved several times before settling in the East New York section of Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that was already known for its gang activity. The boy was named John Gotti, and by the time he was 12 years old, he was running errands for an underground social club run by a Gambino family soldier named Carmine Fatico. What separated John Gotti from almost every other major boss in the modern American Mafia was a fundamental decision he made about how to live. The figures who came before him, from Carlo Gambino to Paul Castellano to Vincent Gigante, had all built their power on invisibility. Gotti decided to be the first man any room noticed. He wanted the suits, the cameras, and the headlines. He was arrested for the first time as a juvenile in 1957. By 1966, he had been jailed twice. He was running with a Gambino crew based at a storefront in Queens called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, designed to look like a non-profit organization, but functioning as the headquarters of the family's hijacking operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport. In 1968, the FBI charged him with cargo theft from the airport. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years. In May of 1973, Carlo Gambino's nephew, Manny Gambino, was kidnapped and killed by an Irish criminal crew led by James McBratney. Carlo Gambino wanted vengeance. The contract was given to John Gotti, who carried out the McBratney killing in a Staten Island bar on May 22, 1973. He pleaded down to attempted manslaughter, was sentenced to 4 years, and reportedly bribed prison officials at Green Haven Correctional Facility to allow him to leave for meetings and home visits. The decade after his release made him one of the most powerful capos in the Gambino family. He was a major earner. He was a protege of Aniello della Croce. He had married Victoria DiGiorgio in 1962, and the couple had 5 children. The youngest son, Frank, was born in 1968. Frank Gotti's death in March of 1980 was the moment that changed his father. The boy was 12 years old. He was riding a motorbike near the family home in Howard Beach when he was struck and killed by a car driven by a neighbor named John Favara. The death was ruled an accident. 4 months later, in July of 1980, John Favara disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing him struck in the head with a club outside his place of work and forced into a van. He was never found. Favara has been presumed dead since shortly after his disappearance. John Gotti and his family were vacationing in Florida at the time of the kidnapping. Gotti always denied involvement. The case has never been formally resolved in the public record. The path that led John Gotti to the head of the Gambino family ran through the December 16, 1985 hit on Paul Castellano. After Castellano's death, Gotti emerged as the new boss. The transition was not authorized by the commission. In April of 1986, a car bomb killed Frank DeCicco, who was Gotti's underboss. Gotti himself had been the intended target. The bomb is widely understood to have been ordered by Vincent Gigante in retaliation for the unsanctioned killing. What followed was almost 5 years of Gotti operating as the most public mafia boss in American history. He held press conferences. He posed for photographers. He wore $2,000 suits to every appearance. The press gave him the nickname the Dapper Don. He went on trial 3 times during the late 1980s on various federal and state charges. He was acquitted in all 3 cases. The acquittals had been heavily influenced by jury tampering and witness intimidation. At least one juror was paid $60,000 for a not guilty vote. The press gave him a second nickname, the Teflon Don. The federal investigators who finally built the case against him focused on a small upstairs apartment above the Ravenites Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Manhattan. The FBI bugged it. In late 1989 and 1990, agents recorded hours of conversations in which Gotti discussed murders, narcotics operations, and family business. He also disparaged his own underboss, Salvatore Gravano, on multiple recordings. When Gravano heard the tapes of Gotti talking about him, suggesting that Gravano should take the fall for several of the murders they had committed together, he decided to cooperate with the FBI. The trial began in January of 1992. Gravano testified for 9 days. He confessed in open court to 19 murders, including the killings of his best friend Louis Milito and his own brother-in-law Nicholas Schibetta. He implicated Gotti directly in 5 of those murders, including the Castellano hit. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on 13 counts including murder, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling, extortion, and loan sharking. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998. He died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri on June 10,
2002. He was 61 years old. Gravano served less than 5 years for the 19 murders he had confessed to. The man who had wanted to be the most famous mafia boss in America had succeeded and had given the federal government every piece of evidence it needed to put him away forever. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. John Gotti wanted the cameras and the headlines, and got both, along with a life sentence and a federal medical center bed. The next case is the boss who chose the exact opposite path. The man who spent 30 years pretending to be insane on the streets of Greenwich Village while running one of the most profitable mafia families in America. Section 9. The Oddfather, the Bathrobe, and the Longest Performance in Mob History. On March 29, 1928, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, a boy was born to Italian immigrant parents who had come to the United States from the Naples region of Italy. His name was Vincent Louis Gigante. He was one of 5 brothers. 3 of those brothers, Mario, Pasquale, and Ralph, would eventually follow him into the Mafia. Only one, Louis, took a different path. Louis Gigante became a Catholic priest and would spend decades testifying in court that his brother Vincent was mentally incompetent. He started out as a professional boxer. Between 1944 and 1947, he fought 25 matches in the light heavyweight division. The nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life came from his prominent jaw. Inside the world of organized crime, he was known as Chin. By his early 20s, he was working as an enforcer for what would become the Genovese family. His mentor was Vito Genovese himself. The job that put his name into the public record came on the night of May 2, 1957. Genovese had decided that Frank Costello needed to be removed. The contract was given to Vincent Gigante. He walked into the lobby of 115 Central Park West and fired a single shot at Costello from close range. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp. A doorman identified Gigante as the gunman. Costello followed the Mafia code at trial and testified that he could not recognize his attacker. Gigante was acquitted. In 1959, he was convicted alongside Genovese on heroin trafficking charges and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. When he came out on parole in the early 1960s, he was promoted from soldier to capo regime. In 1969, he was indicted in New Jersey on charges of conspiring to bribe a 5-member police force. The charge was dropped after his lawyers presented psychiatric reports stating that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. The strategy became known as the bathrobe defense. What followed was the longest sustained performance in the history of American organized crime. From 1969 forward, Gigante was treated for psychiatric disorders on at least 20 separate occasions. His primary psychiatrist formally diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He walked the streets of Greenwich Village in a dingy bathrobe, cheap pajamas, and house slippers. He muttered to himself. He talked to fire hydrants and parking meters. He urinated in the street in full view of FBI agents who were following him. The New York tabloids gave him a nickname, the Oddfather. What he was actually doing during those years was running one of the most profitable mafia families in the country. In 1981, he took over as boss. The family installed Anthony Salerno as a public-facing front boss to deceive law enforcement. The arrangement worked for years. Gigante's actual operation generated an estimated $100 million per year. The family controlled labor unions across construction, garbage hauling, trucking, and shipping. His name was forbidden from being spoken out loud. When his soldiers needed to refer to him, they would touch their chin or form the letter C with their fingers. He also kept a second family on the Upper East Side. His wife and children lived at his residence in Greenwich Village. His mistress and the children he had with her lived on the other side of Manhattan.
The dual life was the kind of detail Hollywood would never put on screen because it complicated the image of the disciplined mafia boss. In 1997, after years of psychiatric evaluations, Gigante was finally declared competent to stand trial. He was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to murder John Gotti, the 1986 plot the commission had been planning before it was called off. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. In April of 2003, with his health failing, Gigante finally dropped the act. In open court, he admitted that the entire performance had been a lie. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. He had fooled psychiatrists, juries, and federal prosecutors for more than 30 years. He died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners on December 19, 2005. Vincent Gigante walked the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe for 30 years and ran a $100 million criminal organization while doing it. The next case closes the story. The trial that broke the commission, the Sicilian boss who dissolved a child in acid, and the truth about how the real mafia ends. Section 10. The Commission Trial, the Sicilian Truth, and the ending Hollywood never filmed. On a cold morning in February of 1985, in the offices of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a 40-year-old prosecutor named Rudolph Giuliani signed off on the most ambitious organized crime indictment in American history. The document named 11 men. Among them were the bosses of all 5 New York Mafia families. The legal weapon Giuliani used was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. The case became known as the Mafia Commission Trial. The defendants represented the entire upper structure of the American Mafia in New York. Paul Castellano of the Gambino family, Anthony Salerno, listed as the boss of the Genovese family, though he was in fact a front for Vincent Gigante, Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family. 2 of the original 11 did not make it to the verdict. Aniello Della Croce died of cancer on December 2, 1985. Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16th of the same year. The evidence the government had built was unlike anything in the history of American organized crime prosecution. The FBI had spent years installing listening devices in the homes, cars, and meeting places of the bosses. After 6 days of jury deliberation, on November 19, 1986, 8 defendants were convicted of racketeering. On January 13, 1987, Judge Richard Owen handed down sentences. Salerno, Corallo, Persico, and most of the other defendants received 100-year prison terms, the maximum possible sentence under RICO. The commission, as Lucky Luciano had built it in 1931, was structurally finished. While the commission trial was unfolding in New York, a different version of the mafia was operating in Sicily. The figure who ran it was Salvatore Riina, born November 16, 1930, in the town of Corleone, the same town Mario Puzo had borrowed for the surname of his fictional Don. Riina was nicknamed La Belva, the Beast. He is believed to have personally ordered more than 150 murders. In 1992, he ordered the assassinations of Italian anti-mafia magistrates Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, both killed by car bombs in Palermo within months of each other. Riina's most documented act of cruelty came in 1993. He ordered the kidnapping of the 11-year-old son of an informant named Santino Di Matteo. The boy's name was Giuseppe. He was held captive for over 2 years. In January of 1996, On Rina's orders, Giuseppe Di Matteo was strangled. His body was dissolved in a barrel of acid. He was 13 years old at the time of his death. Rina was eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder and was serving 26 life sentences when he died in a prison hospital in 2017. The Sicilian reality of what Rina did is the part of the story that Hollywood has never been able to film honestly. The fictional Don Corleone refused the drug trade because narcotics would corrupt the dignity of the family. The real boss of the Mafia in Corleone in the 1980s and 1990s was running heroin into Europe and dissolving children in acid. The two pictures cannot be reconciled. What finally ended the American Mafia's golden era was not just RICO and not just surveillance. It was the breaking of the code of silence from the inside. Salvatore Gravano, after confessing to 19 murders, served less than 5 years for his testimony against John Gotti. Joseph Pistone, the FBI agent who infiltrated the Bonanno family, gave the federal government a complete operational picture. The wall came down, piece by piece. The story of the real Mafia did not end in a tomato garden with a grandfather playing with a child. It ended in federal courtrooms, in prison medical centers, and on Manhattan sidewalks. It ended with the bosses turning on each other, with underbosses wearing wires, with men who had taken a blood oath of silence, sitting in witness boxes and naming everyone they had ever worked with. It ended with Carlo Gambino dead in front of a Yankees game, with Frank Costello growing roses, with Vito Genovese dying in a Missouri prison hospital, with Paul Castellano face down on East 46th Street, with John Gotti coughing through throat cancer in a federal cell, with Vincent Gigante admitting in open court that the bathrobe had always been a costume, and with Joseph Bonanno watching from Arizona as the book he wrote helped bring it all down. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.